Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Yarimar Bonilla. I am the director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College, and I'm so pleased to have so many folks joining us today for this discussion, which is co-organized and co-hosted with our colleagues, specifically Jillian Baez from the Department of Africana and Puerto Rican and Latino Studies at Hunter College. So Jillian will introduce our panelists and she will be moderating our event today. I just wanted to give everyone a welcome and also just remind folks that this is a safe space. I know that this film raises a lot of emotions. For some, it fills us with joy and excitement, but for others, it can raise some complicated emotions about representation, about the history of the ways in which our communities have been represented. And I know that there are lots of strong opinions, but I just want to remind everyone first that there is a place for all those opinions at Centro, and that we want to make sure that everyone can express their ideas and their feelings about this film and about issues of representation of our communities in general. But we want to do so in a way that respects the feelings of others and respects what might be triggering for others. I think what's most important is that we just make space within Centro, which is an academic center, a research center, that we make space to think critically about all these issues. So thank you so much. I know many of you attended the community screening that we did last week and that you left hungry for a conversation. So I'm really glad that so many of you tuned back in with us today to have that much needed dialogue. So with that said, I will turn things over to Jillian. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes. My name is Jillian Baez, and I'm an associate professor in the Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino Studies Department at Hunter College. I want to welcome you all to this panel today, Reimagining West Side Story, a critical discussion of the remake, which is a follow-up event to the Centro's pre-screening of the film last week. Thank you to Centro for co-sponsoring this panel, and a very special thanks to the Centro director who just spoke, Yarimar Bonilla, for supporting my vision with this panel, and to Kimberly Roa and Jose Camacho for coordinating all of the logistics for this online event. I am going to introduce our wonderful panelists in just a moment. I do want to let everyone know what the format will be. So for the first part of this panel, I will be asking the panelists a few questions and we will have a conversation about the film. And then during the second half, we will open up the floor to questions from the audience. So in the meantime, if you have questions for the panelists, go ahead and feel free to write those in the chat, and we will collect those questions as we go and ask them during Q&A. Okay, now to our amazing panelists. So today I'm joined by 4 panelists, each who will have their own entryway into discussing the West Side Story remake. First, we are joined by Dr. Virginia Sanchez-Korrol, Professor Emerita in the Department of Puerto Rican and Latino Studies at Brooklyn College, a historian and creative writer. Her publications include From Colonia to Community, The History of Puerto Ricans in New York City, and the 3-volume Latinas in the United States, a historical encyclopedia. Dr. Sanchez-Korrol has a forthcoming book co-edited with Dr. Maria Perez y Gonzalez called Puerto Rican Studies in the City University of New York, The First 50 Years. She served as historical consultant on the Spielberg-Kushner West Side Story remake. We are also joined by Dr. Frances Negrón-Muntaner, who is a filmmaker, writer, scholar, and professor at Columbia University, where she is also the founding curator of the Latino Arts and Activism Archive. Among her books and publications are Boricua Pop, Puerto Ricans and the Latinization of American Culture, which won the Choice Award in 2004, the Latino Media Gap, which is a foundational study of Latino representation in media, and Sovereign Acts Contesting Colonialism in Native Nations and Latinx America. She has received various recognitions, including the United Nations Rapid Response Media Mechanism designation as a global expert in the areas of mass media and Latino American studies. The Lenfest Award, one of Columbia University's most prestigious recognitions for excellence in teaching and scholarship, and the Latin American Studies Association Frank Bonilla Public Intellectual Award. Negrón-Muntaner served as director of Columbia's Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race from 2009 to 2016, and co-director of Unpayable Debt, a working group that studied debt regimes in the world. Her most recent project is the award-winning Valor y Cambio, an art, digital storytelling, and just economy project in Puerto Rico and New York. And I have to say, she also made one of my favorite films to teach, Brincando el Charco, Portrait of a Puerto Rican. Also with us this afternoon is Dr. Brian Eugenio Herrera, a writer, teacher, and scholar presently based in New Jersey, but he says forever rooted in New Mexico. Dr. Herrera's work, whether academic or artistic, examines the history of gender, sexuality, and race within and through US popular performance. He is presently at work on 2 scholarly projects. Next, A Brief History of Casting, a historical study of the material practices of casting in US popular performance, and starring Miss Virginia Calhoun, a narrative portrait of a deservedly obscure early 20th century actress, writer, producer. Dr. Herrera is Associate Professor of Theater in the Lewis Center for the Arts at Princeton University, where he is also a core faculty member in the program in Gender and Sexuality Studies, a faculty affiliate with the programs in American Studies, Music Theater, and Latino Studies, and faculty coordinator for Princeton's Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program. And last, but certainly not least, we are so lucky to be joined by Bobby Sanabria, who is an 8-time Grammy nominee. Known as a drummer, percussionist, composer, arranger, conductor, documentary film producer, educator, activist, and band leader, his versatility as both a drummer and percussionist from small group to big band has become legendary. A native of the South Bronx, born to Puerto Rican parents, he has performed and recorded with every major figure in the world of Latin jazz and salsa, from the founder of the Afro-Cuban Latin jazz movement, Mauricio Bauzá, to Tito Puente, Mongo Santa Maria, Dizzy Gillespie, Ray Barretto, to Larry Harlow, Ruben Blades, Celia Cruz, and jazz luminaries as diverse as Henry Threadgill, Charles McPherson, Joe Chambers, the Mill Brothers, and many more. His 2018 recording, West Side Story Reimagined, reached #1 on the National Jazz Week radio charts, was nominated for a 2018 Grammy, and won the prestigious 2019 Record of the Year Award from the Jazz Journalists Association. So let's go ahead and jump into our conversation. I'm going to ask the panelists a few questions, as I mentioned earlier. Any of you, as I ask each question, feel free to jump in. There isn't necessarily a particular order that you need to jump in for, but I'm hoping that this will flow organically. Okay, so let's begin with some context for the remake by talking about the original film. Created by gay Jewish men, so I'm thinking here of Arthur Lawrence, who wrote the book, Leonard Bernstein, right, who did the lyrics, Stephen Sondheim, who wrote the music, and Jerome Robbins, who did the choreography. West Side Story began as a Broadway musical, right, in 1957. After winning 6 Tony Awards, the show was adapted into a film in 1961. Within theater and film, West Side Story is considered an aesthetic masterpiece. It's also considered a very iconic film in terms of Puerto Rican and even more widely in terms of Latina, Latino, Latinx representation. However, there have been a number of Puerto Rican thinkers, intellectuals, and also artists who've written about the original film from a Puerto Rican perspective. So for example, I was very much influenced by Alberto Sanchez Sandoval's germinal essay, which I still continue to read and teach, which is called A Puerto Rican Reading of the America of West Side Story, which he published in his 1999 book, Jose Can You See, which is about Latinas on and off Broadway, which put into words some of my own ambivalent feelings about West Side Story's ability to define Puerto Ricanness in ways that flattened my own experiences as a New Yorican. And he really called for a critical reading of West Side Story. And likewise, I invited Frances Negrón-Muntaner to this panel because of her essay, also on West Side Story, Feeling Pretty, West Side Story and Puerto Rican Identity discourses, where she engages with Sanchez Sandoval's essay, and also offers us a queer reading of the text, and where she says that, there's no single American cultural product that haunts Puerto Rican identity discourses in the United States more intensely than West Side Story. And at the same time, points out that West Side Story hails, interpolates, it also calls in Puerto Rican spectators. So I want to, I give that overture there so that we can enter into a conversation about, I think, the larger question at the heart of this panel, which is, why do each of you think that West Side Story holds so much representational weight for Puerto Ricans? Not only in the Anglo-American cultural imaginary, but also within the Puerto Rican imaginary in the US. And if and how do you think this has changed over time?
Well, I would say that one of the reasons that it is so, and today is even more evident, is that it is the only major media cultural product made in the United States that has a significant Puerto Rican storyline. So part of it is its power to interpolate not only at a textual level, which is some of the things that are argued in the piece, but also at a contextual level, which is the most circulated, the most visible, and not only domestically in the United States, but worldwide. So in that sense, it is a question of power.
Well, I'll jump in. I would say that I don't think that, to me, West Side Story is not an identity marker for the Puerto Rican, especially the New Yorican in general. I think what it is an identity marker for a certain time period, which was 1957, and what we were going through at the time. When I first saw West Side Story, I saw it at the lowest theater in the Fordham section of the Bronx. This beautiful ornate theater. It was the largest theater in the lowest chain. It was spellbinding. It was mesmerizing. I've always said that the West Side Story is the greatest episode of the Twilight Zone that I've ever witnessed, because it's real and it's surreal at the same time. And I immediately identified with what was happening on the screen because I was going through that kind of racism, bigotry myself growing up in the South Bronx. I remember I learned what the word spick was in my first week in first grade, because the remnants of who are represented by the Sharks, the remnants of those Italians, Polish, and Irish that were still in the South Bronx didn't like us too much. And my parents went through that. My mother, when she came from Anita Sanabria from Jabucoa, Puerto Rico, in 1949, my father, Jose Sanabria, they're no longer here, but they went through that. He came in 1952 from Guanica. They went through that, and they purposely took me and my sister Joanne when I was 14 on the 10th anniversary of West Side Story to see that, so we could see in many ways what they went through. So I understand. West Side Story suffers from the time period that it came out in. There were a lot of in the 50s. There were a lot of juvenile delinquent movies, etc., Black Boy Jungle and all that. But this is on a different level altogether, in my opinion. And it spoke to me. I identified exactly with what Bernardo and the Sharks were going through. Of course, it isn't a perfect movie. The new version is not perfect either. No movie is perfect, except for me, 2001: A Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick. But that's another discussion. But it spoke to me, and it spoke to me on a visceral level that has remained with me today, and that's why I was so inspired to do West Side Story Reimagined, my take on Maestro Bernstein's incredible score. I think most people, if you can't get past the fact that the reality was that we had to be in gangs at that time, and gangs go back all the way to the birth of this city, this great city that we live in. So it's nothing new. If you can't get past the fact that there were gangs, we had to be in gangs, Puerto Ricans were in gangs to defend ourselves, etc., against other gangs that didn't, from the so-called white community that didn't dig us too much, then you're never going to like this work. You're never going to like the play. You're never going to like the movie in its first iteration or this iteration. But it is a reality that happened, And it's still happening today, except that gangs today are criminal enterprises now that prey on the community. But in those days, they were vehicles for protection and of the community that they came from.
If I can jump in here. Yeah, I think it's very unfortunate that 61 years ago, this film was made that to us, as Bobby just explained, to our generation, as one of my colleagues, Andy Torres, points out, seeing ourselves on the screen in figuring in a major motion picture, that for the first time in our lives we were visible. I think I quoted from his article, which said something about, I'd rather be seen as a tough guy with a knife, but at least I was visible. The period that West Side Story covers was a very, very traumatic period in New York history. Of course, that history doesn't really come through in a movie that is made for entertainment and not documentation. If we were talking about a documentary, it would be a very, very different conversation. And I think that what's remarkably important about the film is that it is the only one that depicts us and defines us on a worldwide scale in a way that is that and I'm talking about the 1961 film that really lacks the interpretation that it should have. And it's really upsetting to know that in 60 years, that is still the only major form of entertainment, the motion picture, that defines us and continues to define us. So I'm very, very glad that the remake answers some of those problems. And I'm also very much aware that the difference between West Side Story, and again, West Side Story 61 and the remake, which is based on 57, is enriched by the scholarship that we have produced in Puerto Rican studies over the last 50 years. We celebrate the 50th anniversary of Puerto Rican studies, and we have produced a body of knowledge, both creative and analytical, that is available as resource to any filmmakers, not just the filmmakers who made West Side Story 2021. And that body of knowledge is finally tilting that windmill. It's tipping the scales to a better understanding and a better reception of who we are as a people and what we have done to make this city great.
And I must say that that was one of the reasons that I did the West Side Story Reimagined project, because Puerto Ricanos in New York have literally transformed this city into a cauldron of rhythm with our music, with our food, our dance, our theater, our intellectual pursuits, scholastically, etc. Every time you go into a hospital, you can thank the New Yorican community, particularly the young lords, for getting those patient bill of rights. That's just one example. Pretty interesting for an. I mean, I could go on and on. Of the 5 greatest musicians that this country has produced, one of them is Maestro Tito Puente, a native New Yorican from East Harlem. So, I mean, it's pretty interesting. A small island, 100 miles long, about 35 miles wide, has produced such greatness and literally transformed this city, as I said, and we've never been given credit for that, in my opinion. And one of the reasons I did the West Side Story Reimagine project is so that people would take notice and give it and say, "Oh my God, I didn't realize these people did this for every subsequent Latino group that has and Latina group that has come here to this great city." And if we did that for this city, which is supposedly the greatest city in the known multiverse, then that says something very, very positive about us. And to see the greatness of Maestra Rita Moreno in the '61 film, and the fact, as Virginia points out from the article from the colleague, that one of the things that spoke to me in the first film was that we were fighting back, and something that we were not known for. Everybody, when we talk about, every time I have conversations with my fellow Latinos, Latinas about Puerto Rico, "Oh, ustedes son tan humildes," and this, that, and you go, "Noble, you guys are so humble," and this, that, and the other. And I go, kind of telling us that we're not warriors, etc. And the fact that Bernardo and the Shucks were fighting back spoke to me in a very incredibly visceral way. Now, as I said before, the film is not perfect, because one of the things that my sister pointed out to me, Joanna, who was sitting next to me, I was 14, she was 12 at the time, she goes to me, "How come all the Puerto Ricans are orange?" And I said to her, "Shh, Tony's orange too." Is he, "Yeah, but he looks Puerto Rican." We had this funny conversation going on. But in any case, that's how the film spoke to me. And I know it doesn't speak like that to a lot of people, but I'm just giving you how it spoke to me. And this new film, what Tony Kushner did to flesh out the characters like anybody's, I think the LGBTQ community is going to be very proud. Chino, Bernardo, Maria, and Anita, the way he fleshed out these characters and added more depth to them, even adds more to this incredible story. That if you have any beef, blame William Shakespeare. He's the one that created this story. But the one thing that I noticed about this film too, and I was, full disclosure, I was on the community advisory board as well, under the direction of Maestra Virginia, was that women drive this film. Women completely drive this film. And that there's something to be said about that. In particular, the character of Anita, who is Afro-Boricua. And colorism, to my delight, was the issue of colorism is raised in this film, because that's a big issue among Puerto Ricanos, because we come in all different shapes, sizes, and colors. And, it's addressed in this film in a very unique way, in one key line that Anita says in the film. I'm not going to give it away. You'd have to see the film. But I think people will be pleasantly surprised with that.
Brian, did you want to jump in before I jump in again? Okay.
Well, I'm not Puerto Rican, so I'm not gonna. I'm Latino, but not Puerto Rican. So that's one of the things. Looking back to Francis's question, is the outsized implication for Latinos also expansive in the way of, there's very few canonical works in either medium where Latino stories of any kind are as central and as influential, and so that's part of why I was drawn to it as somebody who is not Puerto Rican or from New York.
Yeah, I think too, it's important to pull out here too that, with West Side Story, it can be both and, right? And there are different ways of seeing it all. And I certainly have a very complicated relationship to the, the numerous reiterations of West Side Story. I'm 40 years old. And so I was not alive when the film was first released. However, my father was a huge fan of West Side Story, had come to New York City as a young boy. And that was one of the only representations, that he had ever seen of Puerto Ricans. And certainly like as main characters, right, on the big screen. And as children, we watched West Side Story. And my reading of West Side Story was not quite what his was, but I could see the iconicity of it. And to be honest with you, West Side Story was something that would follow me for decades. Because it was the way in which people read Puerto Ricans, particularly those that did not have a lot of real life interactions with Puerto Ricans, right? So for example, I would get the question all the time, are you a Maria or are you an Anita, right? You know, and I would be like, neither and more than that. But at the same time, I think there's a way in which we can't disengage with West Side Story either, right? For so many reasons that were just brought up. So, you know, building on that, I want to talk a little bit more about, you know, rereadings, reinterpretations of West Side Story. You know, Bobby was bringing up, you know, the recording that he did, which is a really interesting, in my opinion, kind of, you know, reinterpretation of the original compositions for West Side Story. By the way, I love what you did with Maria and the bringing in of Ochun and the sweetness and the percussion with that, in particular with that particular track. But I'm also thinking here of like, you know, the 2009 Broadway revival, which had some newer Spanish lyrics done by Lin-Manuel Miranda, which also was controversial when that came out. And I'm also thinking even about, you know, the remake of, the reinterpretation of A Boy Like That by Selena on that album Songs of West Side Story. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about how this remake is in the same vein as some of these other projects, and in other ways, how it goes in a completely different direction.
Well, if I could jump in on that, Jillian.
Sure.
One of the questions that I get all the time now, I'm not asked if I'm Anita or Maria. There are no grandmothers in West Side Story. But one of the questions that I'm getting a lot is the question about La Borinqueña. People are stunned by hearing La Borinqueña. And of course, you know, we had one of the wonderful byproducts of the film for us at Brooklyn College has been that we were able to mount a West Side Story, the Brooklyn Connection lecture series, where we had 8 speakers who were connected to the film directly or indirectly come to speak to our Puerto Rican studies, Puerto Rican and Latino studies class from September to now. And so we were able to delve into so many of these issues. But going back to the issue of La Borinqueña, how authentic is it to suddenly have a character in West Side Story stand up and sing La Borinqueña? And when I first came across it myself, I questioned it. Got to that line in the script, and I said, "Whoa, this is fantastic!" But where is it coming from? How is it that this is there? And I had to go back and do some real study of the history of that time period. And by the way, I was there during that time period. I was a college student when the 57 movie came out. And I looked at it very carefully to try to understand Tony Kushner's script, and began to realize that there, of course, it fits there. The film is a period film. It takes place in 57. It takes place during the time of the Great Migration, immediately following the Second World War. Not only was that traumatic because of the increased numbers of Puerto Rican families that kept coming to New York, but how that destabilized in many ways the Puerto Rican community that had been here for decades. What adjustments they had to make. And looking at it, I said to myself, well, let's look and see where Bernardo is getting this. Bernardo's getting this because in 52, the Commonwealth. 54, Lolita Lebrón, and the assault on the US Congress. 56, maybe, Salvador Agron, the Cape Man. where the community rises up in protest that this 14, 15-year-old is given a death sentence for killing a white man, a white kid, basically based on the fact that he had no education. He was what we would consider special needs today. He was a delinquent, and the system never did anything about it. No one did. And of course, what the community protest is that they got that turned into a commuted sentence. He did not die in prison. What is happening in 58? The Puerto Rican Day Parade. There is an enormous energy in our community for self-determination and for visibility. And they are organized and they are organizing. And then you've got urban renewal, which comes in and completely upsets established neighborhoods, taking away their leadership, their homes, their schools, their churches, and splitting families. And those are the issues that are boiling up during this time. And impressionable young men who are fighting to protect their communities and who have to be tough are very much aware of this. And so at the very, very beginning of the film, when you see the quote from Albizu Campos, well, who else would it be? It's going to be Albizu Campos, because that's in the consciousness, in the public consciousness at this point. You see the light blue of the flag of the light blue that's connected with the flag of Lares that was not permitted to be flown in Puerto Rico. The Commonwealth flag is a dark blue that reflects the American blue in the American flag. So that you have a whole historical background that could very, very easily lay claim to the fact that it's perfectly legitimate for a group of young Puerto Rican men who are being harassed to sing La Borinqueña and not the Star Spangled Banner.
They're doing it with the revolutionary lyrics too.
Yes, well, that was the point, that they're singing it with the revolutionary, lyrics. Thank you.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Maestra, but I get La Ley de la Mordaza, which made it illegal to fly the Puerto Rican flag, or to even whistle the Puerto Rican national anthem, La Borinqueña, was rescinded in 57 or 58, I'm not sure, but which in conjunction with the Puerto Rican Day Parade being formed at the same time. So, but I'm going to honor our brother who is of Mexican descent, Brian, because Vicente Fernandez just passed away, the great Mexicano. And Carlos Rodriguez in the chat, I saw ask a question. I know the questions are going to come later, but I have to leave at 4 p.m. to go to my students at NYU. He asked, the most iconic song is America in the musical, but it doesn't use any Caribbean musical rhythm format. Well, America is a controversia between Anita and Bernardo. That is a musical form in Puerto Rico, one person against the other. But also at the same time, New York Puerto Ricanos were watching a lot of films from Mexico, because the Spanish language films industry in Mexico at the time was equaling or even surpassing their output of films from the United States. So we knew that music intimately well, like people like Vicente Fernandez, Antonio Arguial, and many others. I remember my mother and father taking me to the Teatro Puerto Rico, me and my sister Joanne, to see these films. We didn't understand why the older people around us were so into them, etc. But Puerto Ricans at that time had Mexican music in the house, and that's why Bernstein uses the huapango, which is that rhythm that you hear 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 ta 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 ta. He uses that form because he knew that Puerto Ricans were attending these films, etc. They were part of our cosmopolitanness as Puerto Ricanos in New York City. So I hope that answers your question, Carlos. So there's two things happening: a controversia from Puerto Rico and that huapango rhythm, which we were exposed to as Puerto Ricanos in the 50s into the 60s.
Let me throw out another question that I think is going to touch on, I had planned for, but that's also touching on what's coming up with the chat, which is, you know, in some ways, of course, the remake, missed the mark. And there's a few comments here, for example, on colonialism, and that the colonial issues are not discussed at length in West Side Story, despite the visuals and the music that were added. And Aurora Flores does have an essay that goes into that. I just want to shout that out. But also, so talk about sort of, where it falls short, but also talk a little bit about some of the important interventions that the film makes. So for example, from my perspective, I was surprised that so much dialogue was added in Spanish. And it is not subtitled, which I think is really important symbolically that it's not subtitled, because that indicates that it's for a different audience, or it invites, right, a Spanish-speaking audience in a way that the original did not. But also too, and this was brought up earlier, thinking about the casting of Anita, right, via an Afro-Puerto Rican actress, Ariana DeBow. And that she does have, there are some extra lines that are added that point to colorism, right, within the Puerto Rican community. They're sort of thrown in here and there, but it is there. And so I'm wondering if some of the panelists could jump in and talk about some of these interventions, and also to some of the ways in which you see the remake falling short.
Well, I'll jump in just very briefly to sort of offer my primary point of entry into West Side Story, because it's along these lines. I'm a sort of my own research and work, the chapter in my book, and then the article I've written about West Side Story, which also is in dialogue with Alberto Sandoval Sanchez's book, and then Francis's work, really foundational for me. Both of them are really thinking about the question of adaptation, the question that the story of West Side Story, the phenomenon of West Side Story, and my own interest in the sort of the enduring success and phenomenon of West Side Story is always about a question of adaptation and adjustment, remaking, reviving, which is always also about translation. And in particular, I'm interested in what I see sort of happening again now, which are these parallel tracks of a history that goes back 65 years of sort of adaptation and revival and remaking Romeo and Juliet in this new way, that was also immediately confronted with folks rebutting the inaccuracies of the Puerto Rican representation, even prior to its first performance in Washington, D.C. on a tryout. So there's both of these histories of revival and rebuttal, of this revisal and rebuttal, has been constant and ongoing. And I think that in some ways, one of the difficult parts on the reason I'm so interested in these parallel tracks of revival and rebuttal is that they don't often come to conversation. I've been thinking of them almost as two subway tracks running in the opposite direction, and the space between them is really electrified and separate. And they're very, and so I do think that one of the opportunities that this particular revision of West Side Story affords is, and I think we're seeing a really robust critical conversation emerging all over in a lot of different segments about sort of bringing these two threads together, so that it's not just fans of West Side Story celebrating West Side Story and critics of West Side Story critiquing West Side Story, but we're seeing, especially led by Puerto Ricanas, sort of publishing in a variety of different mediums, sort of thinking about the threads of how do we understand this phenomenon of the enduring success of West Side Story and the cultural power that is still held at the hands of sort of white, Jewish, often gay men who are making these products, and then where are the voices and perspectives, and why is this still, as Francis in the Washington Post asked, why is this the story we're still talking about? This sort of tension is a tension that is part of the history of West Side Story from its outset, and it is very much still a part of, for all of the adjustments and corrections and the ways in which that is, as the other panelists have named, there's a lot of interesting contextual framings and like some very intentional work being done. This tension has yet to be reconciled, nor has it really been engaged. Like this thing of how, like, why are we still fighting about West Side Story if we are? Why are we still celebrating West Side Story if we are? that is the constancy of that tension is something I think is another important part of the history of West Side Story, because it has defined the phenomenon from its outset. The tension of revival and rebuttal is indeed perhaps one of the most enduring features of the phenomenon of West Side Story.
Well, I feel personally I'm ready to say goodbye to West Side Story. But I want to go back to Jillian because it's consuming an enormous amount of our energy that could be going elsewhere. Like telling our own stories, like building infrastructures so these stories could circulate widely. Because quite honestly, if that had been happening over the last 6 decades, we wouldn't be talking about West Side Story maybe at all today. Because people, as Brian, as you say, and as your work does, and I'm really happy you're here, you have this process of reworking culture over periods of time, and that probably is going to be going on for a long time. And that's fine. But there is another context in which there's a dominance of one story in a loop for 6 decades, in a way preventing other things to come to the fore, right? But to Jillian's question on Anita, and I want to say something about Valentina, this character. Anita is a good example of the yes, but. You know, on the one hand, there was a huge controversy around In the Heights, colorism, and not thematizing Afro-Latina identification or an Afro-Latinidad. So you're bringing the Afro-Latino character from the background to the foreground as a secondary supporting character. From a certain perspective, that's progress. At the same time, I feel that the colorism is still structuring who is lead and who is supporting. So the light-skinned character, Maria, is still a light-skinned actress compared. And now, in a way, the Latin Spitfire role gets an update, quote unquote, with an Afro-Puerto Rican actress that is now endowed with even greater sexuality, which goes with the stereotype, right? So on the one hand, yes, it is important for Afro-Latinos to get opportunities and to move into the front. On the other side, on the other hand, some of the logics that structure that relationship is still there. And on Valentina, I feel that Valentina holds the ideological key to this West Side Story, because I actually saw the film twice before I wrote about it, because it seemed a lot of the so-called contextualization or updatings, which to me is greatly anachronistic and problematic in its own way, but it was a distraction from looking at the structure, at its design as a tale. And at the end, it felt to me that the main point of this film has to do with what is white masculinity to do with the major fundamental transformations of demography in the United States. And Valentina, as an elder Puerto Rican woman in the community, choosing to mentor Tony and to continue to have her space be occupied by the Jets to meet and to regañar, the Jets when they have a sexual assault on Anita, pretty mildly, I should say, given the horror of what they were doing. And at the end, doing a sort of citizen arrest on Chino, picking up the weapon, holding him for the police to come. It seems that in a way, Valentina and this version of Maria, and I could go and point some moments where this happens in Maria's also, is a kind of the equivalent of the magical Negro. It's a magical Rican who makes the white protagonist be a better person. And I think Maria, to some extent, has the same role. So that's a very different reading. And I guess that I want to say something about method, which is a lot of our disagreements on it are partially are affective, is about our own relationship and our own history with this narrative. So in that sense, it's not a right or wrong or a correct or incorrect. In that sense, that's not as useful. But it's also like, what are the questions that we bring to West Side Story? What are the questions that it provokes in us? I feel it's part of the dialogue that we haven't really had, not so much as assertions or opinions, but as what are we asking? What do Puerto Ricans want from movies?
Well, I'll jump in
Can
with-
I jump in on that? Or
Go ahead, Maestra. Go ahead.
okay, Francis, you know, one of the points that comes to my mind whenever I'm involved in a project or I see a film, you know, is immediately what is the educational value of this? We were very, very fortunate to be able to build on the film the way that we did at Brooklyn, and with the lecture series, which became a new way of dealing with teaching with Zoom and making a Zoom class much more interesting because we were able to have so many voices and so many perspectives come into the class. And so when you question what comes to my mind immediately with West Side Story too, you know, when I began to well, my first encounter with this particular production, when I was invited to speak to the cast, and my first reaction was, they're planning to do West Side Story again? Okay, then we gotta be there. We have to be there because they're not gonna do that again and leave us out of the conversation. And so I went and I saw, and I realized that, yes, this was a good attempt to bring about a reimagining, which is done all the time in film, you know. I mean, what? A Star is Born is done like 17 times, you know, and each time it catches something and it gets better and better. What really, really bothered me, and I'm at the top of my head, is why aren't we doing this? Why? You know, in the 1960s, when we were faced with when we were storming the universities and fighting to get in and fighting for representation, not only in terms of the student body, but fighting for representation in the curriculum, to again, to include us, to see ourselves, to begin to develop ourselves in an academic setting. Miriam Colon goes and she helps to found the Puerto Rican Traveling Theater on a shoestring, because we needed that kind of culture. We needed to know who we were based on the writings of playwrights, of poets, of writers. The Puerto Rican Writers Cafe, all right, the Poets Cafe is built. Antonia Pantoja's building Aspira. All of these things are happening because we have to do it ourselves. If we want our stories told, we have to write these stories. So what's happened? Why aren't we doing this? I would have thought that by now, you know, we would not be talking about another West Side Story. We'd be talking about the films that we were making. I am looking for people who want to build coalitions to begin to work on these issues. And there are many, many people who are not Puerto Rican who are willing to be our allies, the way they were when we started Puerto Rican studies, and we had a lot of progressive white people alongside us. What has happened that we haven't been able to control our stories?
I mean, part of my work is about this to a large, I mean, the Latino Media Gap. And I think one of the things I learned writing the Latino Media Gap was that I got a lot of people telling me, we just have to convince Hollywood that if they make our stories, they will make money. And in my report, I demonstrate that if they include more of us, they could make more money. So if I know it, they know it. So what's the bottom line? In my work, what I've concluded, the bottom line is that the control of story is everything.
Not just the control of stories, the writing of
Control of
stories.
capital as well. The control of
It's
capital as
everything,
well.
because we get up to go to a job because we have a story that's what we're supposed to do. Nobody picks up a weapon unless they have a story that's what they have to do. Nobody buys into anything unless they've been interpolated by a story. So that's one. And the other one is that I realized that if these industries would open up to the multiplicity of stories and the multiplicity of talent, they would lose control of the story and they would lose control of the employment and the profits. So to me, that's a huge part of it, because it's not for lack of trying. You know, I mean, Latinos and other people of color and women of all backgrounds have been pushing the envelope for decades, and the results are relatively minimal given the amount of effort and the increased diversification of the country over this period of time since the invention of cinema more than 100 years ago. So it's, to me, the bottom line, it's a question of power, which is how it started.
It is. It is a question of power. And we're beginning to see inroads in the literature today. More and more young adult novels being written by people who represent our community, that come from our community. It is a question of power, but in the 1960s, back then, in the late 50s, 1960s, it was also a question of power. And we were able to begin to build grassroots organizations, and we did it.
Yeah, it was.
And you know what? I really think that one of the problems that we have is that we're scattered. We're all over the place, and we're not unified. We don't have a unified dream, a unified base in this direction that we could begin to make it work.
I mean,
and you know, well, okay.
I agree totally with what both of you are saying, and we had advocates back then. One of them was the great Joseph Papp, who advocated for Nuyorican literature, you know, back then. And he's no longer with us, but we need advocacy. Access to power comes from advocacy, and also from we ourselves waking up and saying, listen, we got to listen. The perfect example I can give you for my own self is the West Side Story Reimagined project that I did. That's just one example. I just wanted to address the character of Valentina a little bit. In my reading of Valentina, with Rita Moreno, to me, she represents what Tony and Maria dream of. Because in her character in the movie was married to Doc, a Jewish man. The fact that she lets the Jets come into the shop and caters to them, etc. That was me growing up, because the neutral ground always in the hood was always the candy store, the church dance, the barber shop, and the bodega. You did not fight in those places. You came in, maybe you shoplifted or whatever, whatever as kids were kids. But Valentina represents that to me, and Rita Moreno does an incredible job of it. I wish she was a part of this conversation because she was an executive producer of this film. I'd like to hear her thoughts on what we're talking about. But her character even adds more complexity to this whole story. And I think it was very ingenious the way that whoever came up with that. I'm assuming it's Mr. Kushner, Tony, that came up with that in his writing. So it'd be interesting to get his thoughts on it here too, and maybe there could be a part 2 with them. You know, we could ask them directly that question.
Well, I think
excuse me. I have to leave, as I said before, but I'm going to try to join through my phone. So thank you so much. It's been an honor and a privilege being here, but hopefully I'll be in the car talking to you through the phone. Thank you, everybody. And to everybody, Virginia, Francis, Brian, everybody, Thank you so much. Been a privilege and honor, and I consider you all colleagues and of course friends. And I'd love to discuss this more over some, you know, good Puerto Rican coffee one day. You know.
Brian, I know you wanted to say something. Why don't you go ahead and jump in? And then I just want to say that after that, I'm going to start pulling questions from the audience because we have a number of them.
Great. Yeah, the only thing I was just going to add to the conversation that Virginia and Francis were activating about where might new projects, new content, why over the last 65 years are we still sort of looping in this recursive loop back to West Side Story? And I do think that sort of is one of the most important things to acknowledge, is that I think we can track among theater makers forever how many different theater makers in their own work have named sort of confronting the obstacle of West Side Story, of having to revise and confront West Side Story as a constant reference point. Even if we think about the opening sounds of Miranda's In the Heights, it's invoking the first sounds of that musical are invoking West Side Story. And indeed the whole genesis of In the Heights was Miranda has been very clear, wanted to have another piece in the musical theater repertoire other than West Side Story if somebody wanted to. So there's a kind of way where this piece has inserted itself. It's the elephant in the room. It sort of has to be maneuvered around. And that is a part of what drew me to the research I've done, is like, how did we, like my question was, how did we Latinos broadly get stuck with West Side Story as the conversation that had to be worked around or confronted? And I do think that's one of the additional things in relation to everything that Francis is saying about stories carrying the power, and also the capitalist and colonialist aspect of controlling those narratives. But it is also the way that culture often works, is what is a familiar story is often the first story that has to be moved around. And for whatever reason, and possibly because it's constantly remade, constantly adapted, and constantly revived, West Side Story remains at the center of something that has to be corrected. And that is sort of one of the key operations of its power, is it keeps being it demands attention. And so this is, sorry about that. So this is one of the crucial threads that West Side Story is almost a unique case in that it stands as a consistent and persistent obstacle, having to be negotiated and maneuvered, in part because it has been so regularly revived, reinvented, and reimagined.
Okay, I'm going to pull a question here from it's an anonymous person who writes, in terms of the new West Side Story, Anita is played by an Afro-Boricua, and the film includes Anita's sexual assault. Were there any conversations about this scene and how Anita's race would be brought in? Were there conversations about misogynoir? And perhaps, Virginia, you might be best at answering that question.
Could you repeat it?
Absolutely. Okay, so in terms of the new West Side Story, Anita is played by an Afro-Boricua, and the film includes Anita's sexual assault. Were there any conversations about this scene and how Anita's race would be brought in? Were there conversations about misogynoir?
Conversations about, well, I can tell you what my experience was regarding conversations. And you probably have heard Ariana DeBose has been interviewed many, many times on how she came to get the role. If you see her, if you haven't seen the film and you want to see the film, you're going to find that she's a formidable actress and dancer and singer. She had it all. She had all of the requirements for the role, and she very, very astutely, according to some of the interviews that I have seen on screen, said, "If you're not interested, I'm a Afro-Latina. I am a gay woman. And if you're not interested in hiring me because of those reasons, that's who I am." And she had also a great deal to say about her own culture and ethnic background. I wasn't there, so I cannot vouch for these conversations, but they are now in the public domain. When I joined the production, I read one of the earliest scripts, and the story had already been written. My job was to, as a consultant, as a historical consultant, is to make sure there was some accuracy, make sure that that we were being true to the 1957 period, not only as I had studied it and written about, but as I also had lived it, to look at to make sure that it made that the story made sense. So we were dealing with constant changes. Was there conversation? We had an advisory group that joined in on some of the conversations. I was able to work with the project so that I was able to bring my expertise into refining and dealing with some of those issues. And there was a great deal of conversation. If some of the articles that are being published now, actually replicate some of those conversations. So the answer would be yes, there was a great deal of conversation and a great deal of back and forth, a great deal of concern about language, about the fact that the Puerto Rican community is an emerging community, whereas the white ethnic community is a community that's failing and falling and has been left to the wreckers. One of the key conversations that we had was, what does urban renewal do? And I told them, from my perspective, and from assigned many books. We had a lot of study sessions with the cast. The cast was very young. One of the issues that came up that I found interesting and that I've been thinking of in terms of this particular film is that there is an intergenerational perspective that was important to have, and that was fascinating to me, because you had people like myself and Rita who had lived through the experience, and then you had these very, very young actors who were trying to portray an experience that they had not lived through and that they were not familiar with, being that it was based on the 1957's play. And so there would be a lot of discussion about this and back and forth about it and consultations about this. In one case, I remember some of the cast saying, well, I didn't know about this. I didn't know about this word. I didn't know this was popular then. No, it wasn't. It's intergenerational. And so I called my parents, and they didn't know anything about it. And my comment was, that's because you didn't talk to your grandparents. If you had talked to your grandparents, they would certainly have known something about this particular word or this particular incident or this particular whatever was in fashion and mode at the time. Yes, there was a lot of conversation.
I want to go back to the question for 1 second, because I do think it's puts the finger on a pulse. In my analysis of the way interracial, white, male, light-skinned Puerto Rican desire organizes the narrative, Bernardo and Anita don't matter. They're not in that circuit. They're not in that exchange of gazes. I think Valentina and Maria always adoringly looking at Tony. So therefore, I read that the upping the ante of the sexual assault is because, in a way, Anita is outside of that sexual economy that the film establishes. And the fact that she's cast by a Black woman, a Puerto Rican Black woman, I think can have the effect of the question that you're raising. I think is responsive to the way that is an effect of those decisions of design of the story itself.
Okay, I'm gonna jump into another question. We have a little bit less than 10 minutes left. And there's a lot to tackle here. I want to say we won't be able to really, I think, delve into all of the nuances of the discussion that's coming up. But nonetheless, let's use the time that we have. So Francis Aparicio asked the question, can someone speak to the ways in which the gun violence and deaths of the protagonists may resonate today with the collective mourning we are experiencing as a nation?
I mean, I think that's definitely a subtext that people are going to have. Interestingly, for me, thinking about what a reimagining could be like, that would actually break into pieces some of the problematic dimensions of the story structure, would have been to rethink the ending. Because the genre of tragedy, one of the reasons, going back to Brian's vocabulary or obstacle, I think one of the obstacles is the genre of the film, of the story as a tragedy, in the sense that it doesn't really allow to go forward. Like, even in my analysis of the ways that interracial desire are at the center of this narrative, as it was in the 1961 film, except in the 1961 film, desire was really queer among men, and in this one is heteronormative. So the desire is still a structuring element, but it's actually moved location. But the fact of tragedy actually is one of the reasons I feel that it's very difficult to move in another direction with this story, because at the end, it all doesn't work. Except, and I don't want to give anybody ideas, that in this version, as in Lawrence 2009, it seems like Maria has a one-night stand with Tony, which means that West Side Story 2 could be from the point of view of that child. But anyway.
Yeah, I think I was hoping that really that the film would end differently. And I think we haven't quite touched on the violence in the film and in the original and the way that it's re-invoked in this new film. And I think there was a part of me that was hoping that this would end differently. Perhaps not necessarily not tragically, because that's sort of the centerpiece and the template through which the story is written, but in a different way. Although I will say that I think, and we don't have time to talk about this, the way in which they re-envision Chino's character is much more tragic, right? As sort of like the one sort of hope within the community, as someone who was going to nice school and becoming educated and had very big sort of aspirations in terms of upward class mobility.
Also, I wanted to see Valentina get him a lawyer instead of like sitting there delivering.
Yes, send him to the basement. Send him to the basement.
Yes,
exactly.
Because I think that one of the things that's really important to note about this is that's one of the key elements of the Wise adaptation that is actually retained in this film. In the original stage production, Chino is not delivered to the police. There's not a moment where Chino is necessarily, like, it's a little bit vague. The Wise production leaves Chino alone, entering into the system of the adults, right? And so one of the, I was startled by the fact that, given how much more texture was invested in Chino, that the one aspect of the Wise film that was not the only one, but one of the only dramaturgical innovations that Lehman and Wise did with the 1961 film that survived in prominence was delivering Chino into the justice system. And that's one thing I argue is that that's one of the ways that West Side Story's representational impact is outsized, is that Chino and the Sharks broadly inaugurate what has been the subsequent 65 years of understanding Latino youth through the lens of criminality. And so I think the fact that it retained that thread of the previous adaptation when it didn't have to, because it's not in the original stage, that beat is not in the stage script. But because of the influence of the film, it has been a signal feature of many subsequent adaptations.
Okay. Let's see. We've had a few.
Can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Everybody can hear you.
Okay.
Okay, Bobby, we can't now. Okay, Bobby's frozen. Okay, lots of questions here. Let's answer one of these questions about the audience and about the box office. So Ricardo Oquendo asked, can someone also discuss why the movie quote unquote flopped in this weekend's box office? Who was Spielberg's market audience? Obviously not the Puerto Rican / Latino community.
Actually, I do think that he wanted Latinos to go see the movie.
Yes.
I can't imagine why he and Kushner have gone through all this process if they didn't actually believe that they needed Latino audiences to attend. In one of my pieces, I also think that if Latino audiences did not show up, which seems to be the case, there was also another thing at stake, which was the cultural authority of, white Hollywood to keep representing our stories. So I do think he intended it for us too. I think all those distractions, I call them, all those attempts to update and so forth was a way to bring us in. But he also, I think, counted on that would not necessarily alienate other audiences that are the lifeblood of West Side Story on stage. And if we think about the 2009, which I believe he pretty much took the path of Lawrence in the process of making it, Hispanicizing it further. Lawrence actually had to eliminate the 2 songs in Spanish after 5 months because the audiences that were not Latinos or not Spanish speaking did not like it. So the backlash here could be partly that Latinos are not showing up as desired, but also that other audiences find it alienating in some way, which was also what happened with the 2020 revival on Broadway that took many liberties with its representation and lost some of its core audience. And of course, there's other contextual issues that people are not going to theaters as much as they are. And I think ideologically, the bottom line point of this film, I don't think is that appealing to young people. When I was watching it the first time, I felt there's no way that young people are going to sit through 2.5 hours of this. So I think there's multiple audiences that might have felt not that excited about it.
The other thing,
yeah, I agree with Francis on the point that that they did care a great deal about a Latino audience. That's why they had so many Latino people working with the film, and why they casted so many Puerto Rican dancers and singers to be part of the gangs. And all along, everything that was done in the movie was done according to what a Puerto Rican experience or household would look like at that point in time. If you look at the box office returns, no one is doing well. You're right. A young generation has never, they don't even know about West Side Story. They're not interested in that type of movie, perhaps. It's not surprising. The middle-aged, older audience that perhaps would have been interested, they're not going anywhere. They're staying home, and they're staying away from any place where COVID or any of its derivatives are at play. I do not blame them. The same thing has happened with every movie that is out right now. I think what this requires is a rethinking of venue. Who now? Where do you show it? Is it going to be on? Is it going to be streaming? Is that the way the future films are going to reach us? But certainly every movie that anyone who has gone to the movies recently can attest to the fact that half the movie house is empty. This is the product of our times.
So we've run out of time. So Bryant, why don't you finish up with our last commentary?
Well, I think I don't disagree with anything that's been said, but an additional point of context that is absolutely essential is that it performed on pace with many other films of its similar scale and impact. But like In the Heights and other films, and even prior to the last 2 years, Latino film or films built around Latino stories are expected to exceed expectations in order to be rendered as moderately successful. So the fact that there is a different scrutiny being placed on these numbers, and that West Side Story didn't meet expectations and is immediately rendered a flop, is an interesting other way of the way that the assessment of, are these stories valuable products to be sold? And indeed, the press is jumping on the fact that this is a flop is in some ways part of that broader cultural apparatus that says Latino stories are not worth investing in for mainstream audiences. So I think we need to watch these stories of its flopping, even though we might be rooting for it to not be hugely influential or not. I think the stories of the flop and how quickly they landed, I think, are also worth critiquing in the same register that we're critiquing other aspects of excluding Latino stories from mainstream platforms of storytelling.
Well, it certainly reflects what's going on in the nation now.
Yes,
Okay, Bobby, you're frozen again, but we have run out of time. So we're going to stop here. This is a much bigger conversation to be had. This is not the final word. There's a lot happening in the chat. So thank you all for, for your questions, for your comment, for your dialogue with one another. This was recorded. So if any of you want to go back or share this with others in the future, the Centro will have a link available. So thank you all for coming out this afternoon. And we look forward to seeing you again.